This is Talking Drupal, a bi-weekly chat about web design and development by a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. We record this live on Wednesday afternoons in a Google Hangout. Visit us at talkingdrupal.com. This is episode 127, Wednesday, September 14th, 2016. Today we're talking about local development with Vagrant. Welcome, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Howdy.
Good afternoon, boy. We've had a choppy few months here, haven't we, on recordings? And we actually planned this about 6 weeks ago, and I'm excited that we're finally making this one happen.
Too.
So joining us as usual is John Picozzi from Oomph. How are you, John?
I am doing great. Thanks for asking.
I see you have your DrupalCon Austin t-shirt on today.
I do, yes. Yesterday was LA, today is Austin.
Okay. Do you wear anything but t-shirts?
Yeah, I do. Occasionally I wear collared suits or collared shirts. Sometimes, if I need to, I even put on a suit. But, they are few and far between. I can honestly say there was a direct correlation between the time I started working at Oomph and the increase in my t-shirt collection.
Ah.
I need to see a colored suit.
Yeah, me too.
Hey, you never know. I'm sure somebody's got something out there. Hit it with a Google search and see what happens.
As long as it's corduroy too, corduroy colored suit.
Oh, it sounds uncomfortable.
And the wise guy joining us from Worcester, Massachusetts is Nick Laughlin. Hey, Nick.
Good afternoon. Yeah, it's good to be on a bi-weekly schedule again. Like you said, we've had a couple of cancellations and reschedules, but I think we're back in the groove, and I think this will be a really good topic to jump back in with.
Thanks to our guest, which is Ben Doherty. Welcome, Ben.
Hello.
Ben is a full-stack websmith and opinionator of much. I think that's his unofficial title. His official title is director or technical director at Oomph. He's a long-term Providence resident of 5.5. He's been at Oomph for 5.5 years. You do have a love for Drupal, right? But you're still learning?
Love and hate.
Like all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And Ben is our expert today to talk about Vagrant. Welcome to the show, and thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get right into let's start with our tips for the day and then jump right into the topic. Nick, you have a tip, which is interesting. It says, review your contract. It sounds like you've been burned.
Yeah, so it's not so much that I was burned. It's just that, as this tip is, for workers that have contracts, although fortunately or unfortunately in America, not many employees actually have contracts. But this is really for people writing contracts and freelancers. It's important that every so often you review your contract and just make sure that the language is clear, make sure that it protects yourself, and make sure that any confusing points are clarified so that they don't hold up the process of getting the contract signed or edited or modified. You have to remember that contracts are binding, but they can be modified while you're negotiating. And it's important to remember that on both sides. So I know many freelancers, and in the past I know I've been guilty of this too, where you have a standard contract that you modify for clients, and then you work with a client that's a little bit bigger than typical, and they have their own contract, and they will not sign your contract. Don't be afraid to review that contract and make modifications there as well. You're not required to just accept contracts blindly. And I guess it would sound like this is me being burned, but it's not. It's just I was reviewing a contract and had a couple things stand out to me and just reminded me that I needed to review my own contract because it had been about a year. So
it's always important to keep in mind that a contract really is just the legal understanding of a relationship you have with a customer that you're both have the same goal of making that relationship work. So contracts aren't necessarily bad, but they are important to have in place and to make sure that you both have the same understanding of how you can be successful together.
Absolutely.
So, John, you also have a nice tip today, which is mental health breaks.
Or
about that a bit.
the second part, which is be in the moment. So
Okay.
at Oomph, we've actually been really, really busy for the last couple of months, and everybody is going crazy, working on different projects, having fun, but we're doing a lot of work. Some of us are doing some extra hours, and it's hard sometimes when you're always working, or it seems like you're always working, to kind of separate yourself and be able to take like a kind of mental health break or be in the moment with what you're doing. So the tip here is just that, you can't work 24 hours a day. You need to take breaks. You need to distance yourself from your work a little bit. And sometimes it's even helpful. It gives you that opportunity to take a breather, do something different. And, maybe you come back to it and you see it in a different light, and you're able to fix the problem, solve the problem. But being in the moment is also important, because we can be home with our families, we can be doing other things, but we can still be thinking about work and be thinking about that problem. So when you're with your family or you're doing something that's not work related, be in the moment, be there. Don't be thinking, oh, well, I got to go do this, and I got to go, fix this Drupal site or update that Drupal site. So schedule in breaks. I mean, you don't even really have to make them super long, or like, hey, I'm going to go on a week vacation. Week vacations are nice. I recommend them, but sometimes if you're busy, that's not possible, right? They could be as simple as, like, something I like to do is when I get home from work, my son and I, we go outside and we play baseball, play soccer, or something like that. And, I'm not working. I'm not thinking about work. I'm in that moment. I'm playing soccer with my kid, which is awesome. If you don't have a kid, you can substitute that with a friend or something else. So that's the tip. Just, you can work like crazy, but be sure you have some time for yourself. Be sure you take that break from time to time.
John, since I don't have a tip, I'm going to double down on yours. I agree with everything you just said.
Sweet.
It's really great advice, and especially the part of being in the moment. There's nothing worse than taking a break but spending half that break being focused on something else. And the people around you can tell that and see it, so it doesn't help oftentimes with your family when you're trying to take some time with them.
Very true.
All right, awesome. So let's get into today's topic. So local development with Vagrant. Let's start with, what are we actually talking about here? So everyone has local development environments on their machines. And typically we use, and for me, I'm a MAMP guy because I'm on a Mac, but you got the LAMP, MAMP, WAMP stacks that people install on their local machines. And for me, I can say that, my environment is a little, probably getting out of control after 4 or 5 years of sites that I've developed and things that I've done. And talking about something that is a better way to organize my environment and execute it is, I think, what this topic is about.
A good example of that getting out of control is, I don't know if you remember this, but a couple weeks ago I was working on a site with you, Stephen, and I was having some difficulty exporting or difficulty importing a database from a website to work on it. Every time I dropped the database and re-imported it, no changes were showing up. And it turns out I had 3 separate databases on my local machine that were named almost exactly the same. And I was
connecting to the wrong one.
I was importing the wrong one rather than the one that the site was connected to. So Vagrant is, maybe we should define what Vagrant is, but Vagrant is definitely something that you can use to help combat that issue.
It doesn't help you from being stupid. I'm not saying that you were.
No, it was definitely a facepalm moment. So,
okay.
So how would you describe Vagrant, Ben?
So Vagrant is a great tool that wraps around virtual machine providers like VMware and VirtualBox, and it provides a CLI programmable interface for spinning up machines easily. And so it boils down getting a fully provisioned environment that anybody can work on that should look exactly the same to two words: Vagrant up. So you check out your environment, and then you type Vagrant up and cross your fingers and go get a cup of coffee. And then a few minutes later, you're going to have a machine that's running locally, that's not interacting with the rest of your machine at all, that provides a fully functional development environment.
Yeah, so a good way to think about this is you essentially have a separate, the non-technical version. You have a separate computer running on your machine, on your computer. It allows you to, the really important piece here, two things that you mentioned. One is it's separate from your local machine, and it's separate from the local machine, and it's repeatable. So if you work on websites for any length of time, you'll learn that specific websites have specific dependencies. So you might have one website that needs to run on PHP 5.5 and have Solar on it and a couple of other things. You might have another website that can only run on PHP 5.3. So before Vagrant, generally you had to have all of those different packages installed, and you might end up with an issue on your local machine because it's interacting improperly with one of those versions. Whereas with Vagrant, they can't touch each other. So you're essentially creating and developing an environment that's exactly the same as the environment that the website actually runs on. So it makes reproducing bugs and fixing them much more reliable. And then
I have a question. When you say you're working in an environment, I'm actually working in my environment on my machine. I have code sitting in a repo, and I got my IDE running. How is that piece, just from a high level, connected to this Vagrant server that's running? So, like today, when I use MAMP, when I make a change to the code, I go to the website. It's just the website's running on my machine. I see the changes automatically. Is there some connection between what you're doing locally on your machine and the Vagrant environment that you need to connect together?
Yeah, so Vagrant and your machine typically, but they don't have to, but they usually share a directory, and within the Vagrant machine it's /Vagrant, and so that is going to be wherever you spun up Vagrant on your local machine. So all the files relevant to your project are shared. So you can make your code edits on your local machine using your favorite editor, and they'll automatically be available in the Vagrant environment too, because they're the same files.
So is that where my Git repo would be sitting?
Typically, yeah. So you'll have /vagrant.git, and that's where the Git repository is. And so you can interact with those files within Vagrant, or you can interact with those files without Vagrant on your local machine. So it's all a matter of preference on that one. It's really makes it really easy.
And it's important to note that sharing that space is an option. So if you have another really good use case for Vagrant is testing. So if you have a build process, you can completely separate those so you're not affecting it. You can see what the build out looks like.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of building and debugging, typically you have that shared workspace, and then you can make the edits in your IDE the same way you did before.
So it looks like to me in your description, Ben, that you say that it's a command line wrapper around a virtual machine.
Yeah.
So you could use what virtual machines?
So there are a lot of providers, but the ones I'm more aware of are VirtualBox, which is a free product, and then VMware, which is a commercial product and has quite a lot more horsepower. But VirtualBox solves pretty much all of the problems that we ever encounter. So Vagrant itself is just a wrapper that interacts with these programs. So you can't just install Vagrant. You have to install Vagrant plus a VirtualBox provider. or a VM provider such as VirtualBox. The beauty of Vagrant, though, is that it allows you to define all of the rules for these boxes in a single text file, the Vagrant file. And you can version control this file too, so you can check just the Vagrant file into your Git repository and share it with other developers, and that's all they need to spin up their own Vagrant environment that is exactly the same as yours.
So I'm getting into a new project. I basically clone the repo locally, and I execute the Vagrant file, and I'm up and running.
That's how it should go. Yep, it's great.
Okay, where do I sign up for that?
At vagrantup.com.
Okay.
So Ben, is Vagrant then looking at the Vagrant file and then setting up a VirtualBox instance based on what the parameters are in that Vagrant file?
Yeah, so the Vagrant file is just a Ruby script that spits out some variables at the end. So Vagrant runs the Vagrant file, and then whatever happens during the Vagrant file defines how the box is built. So you can put all the logic you want in this Vagrant file, but typically they just configure a single box. But they can be extended to do any sorts of magic. So they're really powerful. And as I said before, the best part of this is that you're able to put this in version control as a simple flat text file that is, it's a kilobyte worth of data that represents an entire virtual machine and everything that you need on it.
Yeah, to be clear, the first time you build a Vagrant box, or for the first time you run Vagrant up for a particular project, it can take 4, 5, 10 minutes to run. Typically, once you've done that once, though, it's very, very quick, unless you explicitly destroy it and start from scratch. But you're essentially, it's almost equivalent to buying a new computer, installing an OS, installing all the dependencies that you have, putting the code on there and running it. One of the real advantages, like you said, Stephen, is you can just clone the repo, run Vagrant up, and you have it going. But one of the things that can be missed there is that it doesn't matter what environment you're using to develop, because you can now develop in any other environment. So like most people on this call use Macs, and I typically use Linux. Somebody else might be using Windows. That doesn't matter. We all work on the same project and have the same environment for the website, because the actual server that the website runs on is CentOS, and that's what the Vagrant.
So I have a question there. In relation to the script for Vagrant to run, the script is independent of the virtual machine being used. So if I clone a repo, say, and Nick and I are working on a project, Nick is using VirtualBox, but I'm using VMware, that's fine?
So Vagrant abstracts those differences away. Okay. So it interacts with VirtualBox or VMware, but the Vagrant file is written in a consistent language, and the differences between those things are dealt with by Vagrant itself. So you don't even need to worry about that.
Yeah, there are some edge cases where that's an issue, but it's extremely few and far between.
Yeah, I haven't hit one myself.
Yeah,
you have
early on. No, nothing specific. Like 2 years ago, I hit one once, and it was a pretty simple workaround to get it working. But in general, you'll never have an issue.
Mm-hmm. I think another real amazing benefit to Vagrant is not only the software itself, but there's a whole ecosystem of predefined boxes out there that you can use for your virtual machines. So you can go get a running start on a machine that already has, for instance, Drupal and PHP of a certain version on it, and then maybe some Node, and all that stuff's already written for you. Or you can provision the box yourself using the Vagrant file based on a very simple image, like a base Ubuntu 16 box. You can start with that and then add stuff to it, or you can take a box that somebody else defined that already had all that stuff. So there's a whole lot out there to choose from.
And I think there's probably one last kind of feature that's worth pointing out before we start getting into use cases and why it's useful for Drupal developers. And I think that the thing to point out is that you can have more than one Vagrant box running at a time. So if you have a project where you have multiple servers running, sometimes you might have 2 Apache web heads, you might have Solr running, a Memcache server, and a Varnish box. You can, instead of having to rent 7 servers from Amazon to test it, or from DigitalOcean or whatever, you can just spin up 7 Vagrant boxes. You can network them together, and you can test test for issues through in deployment, or however it's working. So you're able to simulate multiple server environments as well on one machine. Now with Vagrant, you need a pretty powerful machine to have too many of those, but it generally allows you to test rolling deployments locally before sending it up to the cloud. So you can it gives you a lot of flexibility.
And even with that really sophisticated setup, it's all represented still in a simple Vagrant file.
Yeah.
So it's still just a text file. Even the most sophisticated internetworked layered setup is still just a text file.
Yep.
So Ben, you mentioned that there are these configurations already out there.
Mm-hmm.
Out where?
Out in, I think on Vagrant Up, on the HashiCorp website, there's a whole list of them.
But HashiCorp, we should mention, so Vagrant is an open source piece of software. I think there's a paid version as well, but HashiCorp is a company that kind of manages and provides support for commercial Vagrant and enterprise Vagrant installations.
So if I'm interested in creating a Vagrant environment, I look on this website and I can find these script files that are my starting point.
Yeah, if you go to the homepage there and you click on, I think, boxes in the upper right-hand corner.
Yep.
Gives you a whole bunch of different setups there.
So let's make sure we get that link in the show notes here under the resources.
Sure.
And HashiCorp's website and documentation is always fantastic. Any of the products that they have great documentation.
So is there anything else we need to say about what the benefits of using this over a AMP environment is?
Would that be Star AMP or Stamp?
Stamp. I was trying to think of how to say that without saying
I don't know.
LAMP.
I just say Stamp. I vote for calling it Stamp environments.
Lat AMP?
Maybe. I mean, I think the primary one is you're removing the variability. So, I might know. So I still typically use my LAMP stack. One of my client servers might be on PHP 5.5.1, and my local might be 5.5.2. I'm typically not changing between versions to figure that out, because usually that difference doesn't matter, to be honest. But if I need you to work on something, you might be on 5.4. Whatever, and at that point it does matter. So it's really the biggest benefit is that consistency, and that you don't have to be, once you set up Vagrant or VirtualBox or VMware, you don't have to be a DevOps guy or a sysadmin that knows how to install Apache or configure Apache. All you need to know is, if you're a designer, all you need to know is go to the directory, type Vagrant, wait until it's done, and then edit the files and you can see them. So it's really good for non-developers to be able to have a consistent environment as well. And if something goes wrong, which occasionally does, you could just delete it and start over.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that those are the two really big selling points for it.
So for someone who's an independent developer and they're working on multiple projects and no one's forcing them to use Vagrant, what would be the reason for them to at least start down this path instead of using the star amp environment they're using today?
I mean, for me, from a really high level, I think it's the ability to have your Vagrant environment be a replica of your production environment, right? So a big issue you have now is that, you know, a lot of times your MAMP setup or whatever setup you're using locally doesn't identically mirror your production environment. So there is a potential there where you push something to production and it doesn't work as anticipated because there's some mismatch in a version number or something like that. With this, you have the ability to mirror that almost exactly. And you know, it removes that basically question in the back of your head of like, oh, this should work, but will it?
What would you guys say is the technical skills needed to run Vagrant instead of using the AMP environments?
You should be able to open a terminal and type Vagrant up.
Okay.
In theory, that's as complicated as it gets.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as somebody else. I mean, that's very different than managing the Vagrant instance or installing Vagrant. But assuming you're in a company that can install it and configure it for you.
No, I'm not. I'm not coming from that angle. I'm coming from the person who is someone who's never used it before, is using AMP WAMP today. They don't have a staff of people to help them out. So
a Vagrant noob, I think, is where he's coming from.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I listened to
Never
this
used it
show.
before.
I'm really excited. I want to use it. What
Thank
do I
you.
do next?
If you can install Drush, you can get Vagrant up and running.
But what are the steps? What are the steps there? So, I mean, at a high level, what are the steps? Like, obviously, I have to install Vagrant, and then what?
So you're going to have to install your VM provider. For most people, that's going to be VirtualBox. And that is a point-and-click installer. So if you can install an application on your Mac or PC, you'll be able to install that. And then Vagrant has a similarly easy installer to get up and running. If you use Homebrew, you can just do brew install Vagrant. And there are other installers that you can use to make it really easy.
So Ben, let me ask you this from the VirtualBox standpoint. Do you have to have? I know VirtualBox, you typically have to have well, at least with VMware, you have to have instances of like Windows in order to be able to run a virtual machine. Is that true for VirtualBox, or is that, you know, basically provisioned for you when you spin one up?
That is true when you run VirtualBox.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I currently have VMware on my machine. I have a couple of customers that I need to keep it on there for, and I always have Windows running. Yeah. I could use VMware instead of using VirtualBox. Is there any benefit for me selecting VirtualBox because it's open source and I'll get more support for it, or should I just use VMware? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, if you already have a license for VMware, I don't think it matters.
Okay.
I mean,
you're more likely to get software support for a licensed version of VMware than you're ever going to get for VirtualBox as open source software. Its support is free, so you know you get that kind of support out of it.
Yeah,
Right.
But that being said, usually, you know, there's Vagrant is extremely popular, and VirtualBox I think is the default. You know, the de facto VM provider. So there's a lot of documentation, and there's a lot of Stack Overflow answers around that. So, I mean, I personally use VirtualBox because most of my development stack is open source.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I have one or two proprietary pieces, so I might as well stay open source there as well. But you know, I don't think there's any disadvantage to using VMware if you already have it.
So we also hear about Docker. What's the difference between Docker and Vagrant?
So I can take that unless somebody else wants to. Docker's a little bit different. There's some similarities. Docker is a container, so it doesn't have an operating system attached to it necessarily. You can, but it doesn't have to. For that reason, they tend to be a fair bit quicker, so it's a bit easier to run more Docker instances than you can Vagrant instances. It's really tough. There's some overlap. There are also slightly different use cases. You'll typically run a few Vagrant. If you're in production, you'll typically run a couple of or in a testing environment, you'll run a couple of different Vagrant boxes. You might run, 10 times that number of Docker instances. It's tough to separate them without. It's tough to separate them without getting too technical. And as Ben just mentioned, it's probably worth mentioning that it's a little bit more difficult to set Docker up on a Mac, although there is an installer and a virtual machine for that. And I think the same is true for Mac. For Windows. So the only way to get Docker running natively is to have a Linux machine. And that Linux machine can be in a Vagrant box. So you can, no matter what environment you're on, you can play with it. But it's a container, so you're usually with Docker you're running one specific process, whereas with Vagrant you're running the whole environment. So with Vagrant you're running CentOS, you're running Apache, you're running Solr. With Docker you're probably just running Solr, or you might be just running Apache, or you might be just running a reverse proxy or Varnish or something like that.
So, Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so Docker is great, and you can even provision a series of Docker instances within a virtual machine as well. So you could have a Vagrant file that defines multiple machines, as we were talking in the advanced use cases earlier, but you can also define a Vagrant file that spins up a virtual machine with a bunch of Docker instances within it. So you can play around with it in that layer too. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Docker is great, and it tends to be faster than Vagrant because you're not running a complete environment. You're running sort of a segment of your own environment. So if you need to test a bunch of different services, you can simulate that within a Docker-divided virtual machine, and it's going to be faster than having 4 or 5 distinct virtual machines running under Vagrant on your host computer.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about if I want to get started with Vagrant. How do we get started there? How do we install it? What's the best way to go about this?
So as I said, you just get a copy of VirtualBox, and then you install that on your computer. And then you install Vagrant using either Homebrew or the installer that you can download from the website. And they have some sample Vagrant files that you can just download and start your projects with. And there are a lot of open source projects out there that include Vagrant files as well. So if there's a project out there that you want to work on, you can just check it out. And if there's a Vagrant file, you can run Vagrant up within it, and you'll end up with that environment. So it's usually pretty straightforward, 3 steps: VirtualBox, Vagrant itself, and then a Vagrant file. Writing a Vagrant file from scratch is pretty easy, but I wouldn't recommend it for the beginner here. You definitely want to start with one that already exists and then modify that.
Am I starting with one that has like a Drupal installation on it? Or am I kind of setting up a server and then installing Drupal and doing those kinds of things?
So there is a Drupal VM GitHub project out there that does just that. It will create a Vagrant instance with a fully provisioned version of Drupal on it, so you don't have to do anything. It's a great project.
And I assume that's any version of Drupal I'm interested in.
I believe it's just Drupal 8, but I'll have to double check. Sorry, we're just trying to leave Drupal 7 behind here. Let's move into the future, can we?
Right.
What's Drupal 7?
Yeah. What's that?
Oh boy. Angry emails. All I can see is the angry emails.
So I'm kind of thinking about myself doing this. So I set up a Vagrant environment, and then I go and kind of tweak it. I need to add a mail server. I need to do these few things to it. Am I doing that in the VirtualBox, in the Vagrant environment, or am I going to do that in a configuration file and then just rebuild it? You understand what I'm saying? So any changes that I have to that environment, how do those happen?
So if you just want to make an ad hoc change, you can log into the Vagrant environment and install the packages. So you could yum install or apt-get install postfix or whatever your preferred mail package is. But if you want that to be repeatable and used by other people, then you need to add it to the Vagrant provisioning step. So when you first run Vagrant up, it's going to create the box based on an image, virtual machine image, that you refer to in the Vagrant file. So I want Ubuntu 16.04. That's your base image. And then the provisioning is it's usually a shell script that you run whenever the Vagrant box goes up for the first time or when you run Vagrant provision. So that shell script, all that does is apt-get install postfix, for instance. So it's really straightforward to get that to be in there. You can create a external provisioning scripts, save it as a separate file, or you can put all that provisioning stuff right into the Vagrant file. It's really all up to you.
Sounds good.
And how do you deal with, so like in an enterprise environment like you and John are working in, how do you deal with getting started and having a database, like a default database that's sort of set up there for someone to start working with?
So that's just more provisioning. So it's additional scripting in the provisioning. So for instance, we might keep a copy of the SQL database and all the essential tables in there as part of the repository. And so part of the provisioning script is to install MySQL and then make sure there's a database ready for Drupal, and then install the database based on what's in the Git repository. So you just pull a dump from that Git repository. So these are rules that you can add to the Vagrant provisioning steps that will take care of those things for you.
Absolutely. And an alternative, although a bit more complicated to set up, is you can have the database on your local machine and just share that connection with the Vagrant box. And then you can kind of manage importing the database separately. It kind of depends on how often you want that database refreshed, if you want it to be automated or not. But sounds good.
Yeah.
So when you, I guess a question that comes up for me time and again is deployment. When you've made a decision or made a change, like Stephen mentioned, where you've decided that you need to switch mail service providers or upgrade a version of PHP, how do you then move that to production? Are you running Drupal in Vagrant on your production machines, or are you just using Vagrant to replicate that production environment? And how do you keep those in sync?
So one strategy that I would have is to make sure that the scripts that install those sort of things or set those things up are consumable by the Vagrant instance and the production instance, so that I can use the same tools in both environments. And because we're in Vagrant and it's supposedly simulating the production environment, the scripts should just work. So you should be able to copy the script that does exactly that and put it on the production server and run it there, and it'll do exactly the same thing, and you'll end up with the same change.
Very good. And if you listen back to our, I think it was episode 109 on Chef, Chef uses Vagrant internally as its test suite as well. So if you're managing your server's configuration with Chef, you can use Vagrant to test that configuration first before you push those recipes up to be deployed. I think that you guys have more experience with Ansible.
That's true. Chef is starting to get obviated by Ansible pretty hard. Ansible is an amazing tool that can be used for provisioning multiple environments and maintaining variables for all those environments in a really simple and consistent, repeatable way. We're just in love with it, especially since we are now in this situation where we have to manage not one production machine or two production machines, but like 12 production machines. And Ansible makes this really easy to do. So we could use the same rules, also known as playbooks and roles in Ansible terminology, to define how the Vagrant box works, as well as the production box. And Vagrant has facilities for consuming Ansible playbooks built right into it, which is a really nice feature.
Ben, just out of curiosity, can you like stack those playbooks? So if you wanted to have, if you were managing 12 servers and you wanted to have like a core set of configuration, and then you wanted to have like server specific configuration, can you kind of stack those?
Oh yeah, so Ansible allows you to slice and dice and compartmentalize the grouping of the servers and the variables associated with each of those groups in a lot of different ways. It's extremely powerful. So this allows me to say for all the Linux machines, install PHP 5.6, for instance, and then all the web machines install Apache 2.4. And so the web machines are also Linux machines, so they get PHP 5.6, but they'll get the Apache instance, but the rest of the Linux machines won't.
So is Ansible open source?
Ansible is open source. You can go ahead and contribute to it. It's hosted on GitHub. They have a very vibrant community and tons of developers working on it. It's mostly based on Python, but you can write modules for it in any language as long as it consumes JSON and it emits JSON.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's a great tool.
All right, so kind of wrapping things up here. I know we talked about going to the vagrantup.com site and kind of looking around there for information and resources. Ben, do you have any other resources that you can recommend for getting started with Vagrant or using Vagrant?
Yeah, so I think the HashiCorp and Vagrant Up websites are great for Vagrant themselves, but in terms of Vagrant in Drupal, I think Drupal VM project by Jeff Geerling is a great start for getting that going. It gives you a Vagrant file that provisions a fully working instance of Drupal that you can just spin up and start working on right there. So I think that's great for people who want to experiment with Vagrant and Drupal.
Very cool.
I'll second that.
Does anybody have any other questions?
I think I think we've talked quite a bit about how easy it is to get Vagrant up and running, get an environment running with an existing Vagrant file. We talked a little bit about looking at examples. I think one thing that we haven't necessarily covered is how, if you don't have too much experience, how difficult is the road to writing your own Vagrant file. Like, say, for example, you need to change the PHP version or you need to add another package that's available. It sounds like it's just a bash script that you're running in there. Is that accurate? So it's, as long as you're comfortable in the command line, you should be able to modify
Typically, so after those sort of things, installing server software, that's all stuff that happens after the Vagrant box is spun up. That's the provisioning step, and that's typically just a bash script. In terms of writing a Vagrant file from scratch, you're going to have to know Ruby, and you're going to have to know what Vagrant is expecting for variables when the Vagrant file is completed. The sort of things that you're going to adjust in the Vagrant file itself would be, how much memory is this machine going to get, or how many CPUs am I going to allocate for this machine, or what is the base box image for this machine, or the name for this machine. But beyond that, everything that is beyond the very core operating system or machine definition, that's all just in your provisioning script, which again is just bash.
Okay.
But you could also, I mean, to the flip side of that, you could also grab one of the boxes from, the Vagrant website and look at that Vagrant file and manipulate it how you needed to. So, for example, if you were just looking for like, a basic lamp stack, you could grab that Vagrant file and then add whatever modules you needed to it, correct?
Yeah, so what they offer aren't so much Vagrant files as they are base machine images. So your Vagrant file would point at those, but otherwise the Vagrant file would look the same as any other Vagrant file.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
And the last question I think I have is, are there any common pitfalls to watch out for, particularly related to Drupal, or is it a fairly well-documented process?
I think my main beef is that it is slow. It is that, and I think that's the major drawback of using Drupal within a virtual machine. Drupal is already on the slow side for its process a web page, especially if you're working in a development mode where you have all the caches turned off and everything. But take that slowness and multiply it by 2 to 10, and you'll have a sense of what it's like to work in the Vagrant environment. So that is the major drawback from my perspective. But otherwise, given all of the consistency and predictability that you get out of it, I think that more than outweighs the slowness issue.
Very good. Do you guys have, I know I said the last question, but do you guys have what percentage of adoption do you guys have internally for Vagrant? Do you guys do all development on Vagrant, or is it kind of a personal preference, or is it only when debugging specific issues?
So we tried to have a practice where we have a Vagrant file for every single one of our projects. All of our new projects have it, and they're meant to simulate the production environment as much as possible. But realizing that it can be slow and it can get in the way for certain developers who would rather just host the development version of their site on their own machine, we just leave it up to them. I personally tend to use just my own local MAMP stack over Vagrant for a lot of common cases, but if I need to test something that is only available within that environment, it's right there for me.
Okay.
Awesome.
Very good.
All right, so I think we're going to wrap up the show if nobody else has any other questions. I mean, I know Nick probably has about 100 more, but...
Always.
But
we can wrap up.
All right. So let's jump into our module of the week. This is actually a module that I recommended. It's an add-on module in Drupal 7 for IMC called IMC for File Field, or IMC File Field. And it basically allows your users to select an IMC, use the IMC browser to select a file on a file field. So what it does is when you install it, you have to go into the file field and enable it. But once it's enabled, it gives you a button on the file field right near the upload button that allows you to basically browse the file directory of IMCE and input that file into that file field. So it reduces the amount of duplicate uploading you have to do. Now, in Drupal 7, this is an add-on module. In Drupal 8, it's actually rolled into IMCE. So there are a bunch of features in IMCE for Drupal 8 that are kind of rolled in, that had external modules or add-on modules in Drupal 7, and this is one of them. So I recommend the IMCE file field add-on. Definitely really great to manage files and minimize the amount of kind of duplicate content you need to create.
Very good. So I think that wraps it up for the week then. So thank you for joining us, Ben. If people have any questions about how you're running Vagrant or anything about Ansible, where can people reach you online?
I think just tweet at me at the below Twitter handle @DomServer.
Very cool. And John, where can people find you?
You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi. You can find me at the end of this month speaking at NedCamp up in Manchester, New Hampshire. Ben's actually going to be speaking there too.
I'll be there too.
If you have questions, Ben's going to be doing a talk similarly, talking about Vagrant and some of the other tools that we're using. So check us out at the end of the month. You can find out more information on that at nedcamp.org. And you can always find out about oomph at oomphinc.org, or oomphinc.com rather.
And Steven's audio, I think, has cut out, so you can find him at Stephen Cross pretty much everywhere. And then myself, you can find at Nixvan, N-I-C-X-V-A, and pretty much everywhere. And as John mentioned, we do have NetCamp. There's still spots for training September 30th, and I think you can still sign up for or register for a hotel part of our block. You get a nice discount until tomorrow evening. So the main camp is October 1st, and I think it's going to be really good this year. We have a focus on accessibility. So if you're in the area, we'd love to have you. And I think that's it for this week. See you in a couple weeks, guys.
Have a good one.
Thanks a lot.